here we are again. What's up, everybody? We're back with episode 10. Hey, that rhyme. Here we are again, back with episode 10 of the Takeover. It's just natural, off the top of the dome. I just got it like that. Anyway, I'm your host, Marcellus, sitting here with your co-host.
One of the greatest co-hosts to ever have been born in the United States of America, Justus.
Well, he putting a lot on that co-hosting thing, but...
Well, it's because it is a lot.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Justice. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Speaking of Justice, we are going to be talking about...
My twin?
Not his twin, but we are going to be talking about racism in America, justice, and freedom. So today is kind of a heavy topic. We want to prepare you. Disclaimer. The thoughts and the words of this show are representative of this show and this show alone. So they're representative of myself and Justice. These are in no way to be taken as Kingdom of Heaven Ministries thoughts. No way to be taken as Pastor Brown or Lady Fran's thoughts. These are our thoughts that we're sending over the microphone to you. So just take that disclaimer. We're definitely going to share some personal thoughts and some stories and anecdotal things. And I want everybody to understand that this is us. Okay. So as we enter into this, we want to start with a scripture, Acts 10:33 through 36. And as you all know, we are in the what version?
Oh, you should already know. But if you don't know, the New Living Translation.
New Living Translation. So it starts as, so I sent for you at once. Now this is Cornelius talking to Peter. I sent for you at once, and it was good of you to come. Now we are all here waiting before God to hear the message the Lord has given you. Then Peter replied, I see very clearly that God shows no favoritism.
In every nation, he accepts those who fear him and do what is right. This is the message of good news for the people of Israel, that there is peace with God through Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all.
So we want to make sure that is the overriding message throughout all of this, is that God is not a respecter of persons, as the King James would say. But before we get started, we have to talk about what's going on current events in our country. And that starts with our COVID-19 Chronicles. I don't know if you saw this, Justin. Did you see the pictures from Missouri, Lake of the Ozarks on Memorial Day?
Yes, I did see those pictures, and there was actually a anchor for CNN working, but turns out his camera crew, nobody was wearing a mask out there, and he had the audacity to ask people why they weren't wearing masks. I say take care of your camera crew first, but yeah.
Sweep around your own front door before you try to sweep around somebody else's.
Okay.
It's an old song.
Yeah.
Sweep
I
around your own. Oh, my bad. Not going to go there today. But you know what? Memorial Day was pretty much a disaster all the way around from what I saw in terms of people and their physical distancing. And, you know, people got a chance to be out and some of the restrictions are lifted and people took full advantage. And like I said, if you're with your family, you know, go for it. But when you're out here in these social places, remember that these masks aren't really about you. They're about everybody else. And so wearing it just shows we're thinking about our fellow man. We're thinking about our brother and our sister, and taking precautions for them. So hopefully we don't continue to have repeats of that before we get, you know, too far gone here. Just as an FYI, total as of right now today in the state of Michigan where we are, we've had 56,014 confirmed cases and 5,372 deaths. So roughly 10% of the people that have gotten it have died from it. That's an awfully high mortality rate.
Yeah, I hear it's going down. It's been going down. That's what I heard. But the numbers don't lie. So there's still a risk out there. So be careful.
Just remember, 10% is 100% if it happens to you. So we do what you can, do what you have to do, and do what you can, because more places of employment are opening up, and it won't be too long before churches open back up. I can see you're excited about that.
I'm very excited. You know, I've been telling him, I said, listen, once this thing is over with, we all going to be in church. And he's like, you know what, maybe not, you know. I think we're going to have to ease into it. I'm like, no.
Yes, we're going to have to ease into it. He's just excited. But you know what people don't think about that we're going to have to worry about? Maybe not worry, but be concerned about in churches.
What?
Think about this. Imagine having a service with no praise and worship. Doesn't sound good, does it?
It don't sound good.
But some studies show that singing can propel droplet mist 25 feet. So imagine now you got a choir / praise team singing at you, and then you got the congregation singing with them, and all the spit that's in the air, potentially virus carrying. Churches, you got to think about this. Okay, this is one of the things that we don't think about. Doesn't come up a lot, and it's kind of difficult to consider. You know, speaking of singing and things, when we get back to that point, one of our sponsors, they have something for us to deal with that. You know, this episode, let me get this sponsorship here so I'll make sure I read it correctly. This episode is brought to you by the one and only Testaments. What are Testaments, you ask?
I didn't ask.
Oh, okay. What are Testaments, you ask? They are wonderful little things we can give out to help pass the word. Have you ever wondered how you could let someone in church know that their breath was offensive, but not be offensive to them? How to give them the word and help them next time they say a word? We have the answer for you. Give them a testament or two. Each mint is wrapped in a verse of scripture, so you pass the word while you're passing the mint. They're available wherever biblical mints are sold.
Where are biblical mints sold?
Find them by Google. You gonna get some?
No, I'm not gonna get any.
Oh, you need to get some.
What is that supposed to mean?
I kid. But what's not a laughing matter, Justice, is racism. It's racism, and it is as much as we want to believe racism is gone, it's a thing of the past. The fact of the matter is we're still, recent history has shown us that we're still dealing with it. So I guess we need to examine what it is first of all. I heard somebody say, before we look at the spiritual definition, I heard someone say that racism was power plus privilege, and that you had to have both of those elements to effectively be racist. I think that's interesting. I don't know if it's wholly accurate, but let's look at the spiritual definition of what racism is according to Words in Different Light, which is our spiritual dictionary here that we use. Now, this part is Dr. Brown's. This is his definition. And it says dark racism is restricting affinity, culturally insisting its superiority that mandates separation. It is defined by racism as the narrow-minded intolerance of some on the basis that biological differences make some men inferior to others, thus hindering the expansion and advancement of the kingdom of God and from experiencing the enjoyment of a kingdom lifestyle. Now, there's some laws that go along with that, Justice.
First of all, I want to give honor to my pastor, Dr. Lonnie Brown. 3 laws that govern racism: inequality, bigotry, prejudice, intolerance, narrowness, and injustice. And we're going to talk about justice in a little bit, which is unfairness and discrimination.
Wow. I'm sure people know the Bible talks about slavery, but I wonder if people know that the Bible talks about racism in general in certain places as well, and deals with this. One of the places is in Numbers, and this is, when I read this, it kind of caught me off guard, because sometimes it can come from your own family. It can come from your own brother and sister. It can come from your own family or friends, people who you would never think would have racist tendencies, but they can slip into it or have something buried inside of them. Numbers 12:1 says, "And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married." Now think about that. It says that it continues to say, "For he had married an Ethiopian woman." So the only reason they spake against him was because he had married this woman who was an Ethiopian, his own brother and his own sister. So racism is dark, and it is unfortunately been a permanent element in our society since the existence of the American society, and that's unfortunate, Justice. And we need to deal with it. The church, I think, has, again, these are my thoughts, I think has run from this discussion to a degree, because it's difficult. It's a hard discussion to have. It's hard to think about. There's a lot of things that come up. I know for myself personally, for the last 2 days, I've had a difficult time with the thoughts that have been running through my mind. And we'll get into some of that a little bit later. But I look at my nephews that are here right now, and I look at them, and I have to, in some ways, feel saddened that they have to come up during such a time as this. And even though we say, oh, it's much better than it was, man, sometimes I wonder, is it better just to know than whether to wonder if somebody is being racist behind your back? But if we look up racism in the good old dictionary, like Justice likes to do, what does it say?
Racism is defined as a belief or doctrine that inherent differences among the various human racial groups determine cultural or individual achievement, usually involving the idea that one's own race is superior and has the right to dominate others, or that a particular racial group is inferior to the others. I don't know about you, but that sounds like Webster. Anyways, the second definition is a policy, system of government, etc., based upon or fostering such a doctrine, discrimination. And we'll get into some laws that were passed in the southern states that go along with this definition. And the third one is hatred or intolerance of another race or other races.
So, the thing that gets me about this definition, Justice, that strikes me, I don't know if it strikes you, but it's the idea that a certain group or one's own race is superior and has the right to dominate merely because they are that racial group or that skin tone, because we know that we are all one race, and that's the human race when it's all said and done. But we're kidding ourselves if we say we don't see color. That's just not the truth. And it's not what we really want. I don't want people to tell me I don't see color, because that's not reality. I want people to say, I see color, but I honor you. I appreciate you. I appreciate your culture, and respect one another's culture, regardless of what color of their skin is. And that's really the key to me. Is the goal is, I don't want people of a European descent, white people in this situation, to say, I don't see your color. I want them to say, I will fight against the racism that comes against people that look like you. I will fight with you because I respect you. That's all we want. That's all anybody should really want. So the idea that somehow there's a supremacy merely because of the color of your skin is just beyond me. And I know it's different for us, Justice, because we grew up in the church being taught the whole time, there's one race of people. We're all the same in Christ. So we have a different, I think, initial outlook on race when we go out into the world because of what we've been taught and what's been put in our hearts. I read a book a long time ago written by Emmanuel Johnson Sr., a book that was way ahead of its time, but it was a book called I'm Not Black, You're Not White, which I think he should re-release. This was written way back in the, I think, early 90s or late 80s, and it did a very phenomenal job of examining where cultures come from, where the different white people are, the pigment of their skin and the melanin and those things that people use to describe races, even though it's just describing a very small part of our composition. I mean, pigment is not a lot of our makeup. It's very little. So it's tough. It's tough to think about, but we have to start with some history. We have to talk about what was going on in this society. And we know that as Europeans started to settle different worlds, they went over to Africa. There's differing accounts on how they got slaves. Regardless, they got slaves, brought them over here to the U.S., shipped them over here, literally, in ships, bodies stacked on top of each other, people dying on the trip over and being left there to rot while hundreds of others are around them in tight quarters along this route over to the U.S. And so you go from those ships to slavery in the fields and different areas. And it began the history of this country, and unfortunately has permeated all the way throughout history to now. But Justice, why don't you give us some background on how in the 1800s things were starting to change?
Well, in the 1800s, in the first half of the 1800s, Great Britain had abolished slavery in the UK, and a lot of other European countries kind of followed their lead. And the United States, Republicans in the Congress, the northern states, thought that there was time to abolish slavery. So they set this plan out. They said by this time, slavery will be abolished and all the slaves will be free. And of course, the southern states, they didn't like that. So they started seceding one by one from the United States. And then, as you know, the Civil War broke out between the North and the South.
Well, right before it broke out, there was estimated 4 million slaves. The vast majority would have been African slaves.
Right. Yep.
4 million. That's crazy.
And what's funny is slaves made the majority in a lot of those states, especially in Mississippi, in Alabama, and in South Carolina. They made up the majority. And later on, you'll see what that majority meant for the African-American community down there. But so it was time for change. The 13th Amendment of the U.S. ratified in 1865 in the aftermath of the Civil War abolished slavery in the United States. And it said, this is what it stated: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction.
So it seems on the surface level, that being a part of our Constitution, it seems, I guess that, it seems like slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment, but I know it couldn't have been that easy because, you still had things such as the black codes that were going on. And the year after that amendment passed, they came back because of that passing, and they passed the nation's first civil rights bill, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which invalidated those so-called black codes, and they were basically the Confederate States' way of controlling the behavior of black folk in America. So it basically kept them dependent on their former owners, even though they were free. So this first initial Civil Rights Act of 1866 was to invalidate those codes, and then they required the former Confederate states to ratify the 13th Amendment in order to regain representation in the federal government. So they wanted back in, you had to ratify this 13th Amendment. So Congress was trying to put together a plan to eliminate slavery in our country.
And together with the 14th and 15th Amendments, also ratified during that Reconstruction era, the 13th Amendment sought to establish equality for African Americans. Despite these efforts, however, the struggle to achieve full equality and guarantee the civil rights of all Americans will continue well into the 20th century.
21st even.
21st even. But remember how I said the majority in the states were African Americans. And so once the 14th Amendment came out, 15th Amendment, all right, there we go. Once the 15th Amendment was ratified by the states, Senator Hiram Revels, well, actually, he wasn't voted in. He was appointed by the state's legislature in Mississippi. Unfortunately, his term only lasted 1 year. But by then, South Carolina had elected its first black representative in the House of Representatives, Joseph Rainey. After the controversial passage of the 15th Amendment, these men saw an opportunity to attempt to alter the future for African Americans everywhere.
So you know what? It's funny that you point that out, because I didn't know you were going to say this, but it ties into what I said earlier about racism taking privilege and power. And in order to combat it effectively, you need to have some power. And getting people in positions of power. One of my friends said the other day that the fight against racism starts with politics. And as much as we don't want to think about that, but there is some truth to it, because people that are in positions of power in political arenas can then enact laws to effectively combat the problem of racism that we have. So it is interesting that you brought that up, and that we needed to get people, and still need people, the right people, not just any people. Don't get me wrong. It's not just good enough to have any person in a position of power just because they're a person of color. We need the right people in those positions, but we need them, and they need to be where they can succeed.
Correct. But remember how we said, or how you said, I guess you remember how you said it, but he said the struggles really extended out into the 20th century. And so we have to ask, was the 14th Amendment enough? So in these southern states, these lawmakers, they had to get a little creative. They had to stay equal, but they wanted everybody separated. So they came out with these outrageous laws. Like, here's one in Mississippi. And this was actually a law in Mississippi. It says, any person who shall be guilty of printing, publishing, or circulating printed, typewritten, or written matter, urging or presenting for public acceptance or suggestions in favor of social equality or of intermarriage between whites and Negroes, shall be guilty of a misdemeanor and subject to a fine or not exceeding $500 or imprisonment not exceeding 6 months or both.
So wait just a second. You telling me if somebody put out a flyer that said, congratulations to the new couple who happens to contain a white person and a black person, that person was guilty of a misdemeanor and subject to 6 months imprisonment?
That's correct.
And potentially a fine.
That is also correct. Now, you have to remember, $500 back in the day was a lot of money. I don't know the exact calculations of it, but that's a lot of money. And so you have states like Alabama where the epicenter of this really was, well, the epicenter, pretty much. In Alabama, there was a law. There's a lot of laws in Alabama, but this one probably is the most ridiculous. It said it shall be unlawful for a Negro and a white person to play together or in company with each other at any game of pool or billiards.
I'm not even sure how to respond to that. I don't
Wow.
even know what to say about that. How important was pool or billiards?
That the state legislature would make this a law. This wasn't a local law. This was a statewide law.
Think about this for a minute, though. First of all, we're talking about things that happened in the late 1800s, right? We've been talking about so far 1865. That's not very long ago. That's 155 years ago. This isn't things. These aren't things that have been happening 300, 400 years ago. These are things that have been relatively recent, including this Civil Rights Act of 1964, 56 years ago, which ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This act is considered, if you will, one of the crowning achievements in the civil rights movement. As we know, this came shortly after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech in 1963. The Civil Rights Act came shortly after that. But think about this, man. 56 years ago, my parents, your grandparents, were around before this was enacted. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, my Nana was living in Mississippi at the time. She was born in 1955. And so her and my Aunt Bertha and all of them, they were alive down in Mississippi.
And going through, I mean, so when people act like we need to get over it because, oh, that was such a long time ago, nah. We're merely one generation removed from things having to take place, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Correct. So it was first proposed by probably one of the more popular presidents, President John F. Kennedy. And it survived strong opposition from Southern members of Congress, but it was then signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson, probably one of the more creepiest presidents. In subsequent years, Congress, what is going on with me? Congress expanded the act and passed additional civil rights legislation, such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They talk about Jim Crow laws, restricting African Americans the right to vote, because they could vote, but there were some limitations. You had to be literate. You had to be your father had to be able to vote in order for you to vote. So it's a bunch of mess. But that act, that Voting Rights Act, basically took care of all of that.
Kind of.
Well, they tried to.
Kind of took care of all of it. And we have to ask ourselves, all of these things are taking place, all this legislature, and still we had to have April 4th, 1968 happen, which was a day after Martin Luther King Jr. spoke in the speech, I've been to the mountaintop. And if you haven't heard that in a while, or if you haven't heard it at all, make it a point to go on YouTube and listen to I've Been to a Mountaintop. The next day after that was April 3rd, 1968. And on April 4th, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And it sparked outrage, obviously, and riots. So we're talking 4 years after the Civil Rights Act, right? And we're still dealing with our civil rights leaders being persecuted, killed, murdered. And so these riots happen. And if you look back on the pictures, it was on the cover, I believe, of Time magazine. These riots and tear gas being used and police breaking up these riots. And it looks eerily familiar to things that just happened several days ago in Minneapolis. And so you start to ask yourself how much has really changed. And my cousin, her name's Tanya Lewis, she wrote about the riots in Minnesota, and I want to share her thought because I found it very interesting. It said, volcanoes erupt due to tremendous pressure. Once an eruption begins, the damage is nearly impossible to control. There's no intelligence involved during destruction, only chaos. All you can do is get out of the way. Intelligence is exposed only after the eruption subsides and life finds a way to recover. And so the thing about it is, if you blame the protesters for setting the streets of Chicago on fire, you're not looking at the right root cause. None of that happens without the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And so that volcano never erupts. And it means you don't fully understand the problem. The problem is not in the eruption itself. It's in the pressure that caused it. And that's where we have to get to. And so this is, in my opinion, this is the thing that we haven't wanted to deal with in the church, is that pressure that causes this eruption, that causes these things to break loose, and these feelings that particularly younger men of color have. And we need to deal with that. And this show, as we promised you, we're dealing with these things. But we need to introduce the idea of justice. Justice.
Is that time again? Well, what is the dictionary.com definition of justice? Well, it's a noun, and it means just behavior or treatment. Just treatment. Fairness. Equality. That's what justice means.
Which goes to ask the question, Justice, has justice been served? Is justice ingrained in our society? Because by definition, you said just behavior or treatment, fairness, equality. Is that the law of the land?
I think for certain people, justice is served. If you got wealth, if you are a certain type of person, the justice system is running to try and meet your needs. But then you have these people over here that need it just as much as they do. And there's really no care here.
And what differentiates the people here?
Well, I have been to the circuit court of Genesee County so many times, and you never see an American of Europe. I'm trying to be politically correct here. An American of European.
We need to be real, more so than politically correct right now. So tell us what you mean.
A Caucasian American. There you go. On the stand nearly as many times as an African American on the stand. And when you're in the courtroom and that African American is on the stand and you have the jury over here. Now, I read a study, and the jury will convict an African American, is much more likely to convict an African American on a murder charge or any type of charge like armed robbery, armed assault. Much more likely to convict an African American than a Caucasian American. And I'm thinking, okay, so wait, what if a Caucasian American and an African American committed the same crime? then the jury would have to convict, right?
You would think.
But the jury would convict both of them. But then they have an opportunity to say, okay, does this person deserve manslaughter? Or does this person deserve murder too, which is a life sentence in this state? But it could mean death in other states. So they're much more likely to give a murder to charge to an African American and a lesser charge to a Caucasian American. I'm trying to think, why is this the case? You know, we've been through the Civil Rights Act. We've been through the Emancipation Proclamation. We've been through the Civil War. Why is it still like this?
You know, I remember, I'm going to address your question here shortly, but I remember when I was your age, and I used to have a different worldview than I have now as a over 40-year-old man, black man. And I normally say American of African descent, but I think for this discussion, we need to just say everything that everybody's going to understand. All right. So being a black man, it gives you a different perspective when you have experience and time to go with it. And you ask the question, Justice, as to why. And I think the real answer to why is because racism is systemic in our legal system. It's systemic in our justice system. It's systemic in our lawmakers. It's systemic in every part of the backbone of this country. And therefore, it won't just go away by waving a wand. So racism, man, it's ingrained in everything. And unfortunately, it's a part of the situation. And it's still here, and it's still in this country. And sometimes it's overt. KKK, the skinheads, people like that were overtly racism. So they had the white hoods, the swastikas tattooed on their arms and things like that. And then you have the covert races that don't show you until situations happen and they start saying certain things. Some of your friends will do that when they talk about Colin Kaepernick, for example, taking a knee. And when you post that and they get outraged over somebody taking a peaceful protest at the advice of a Marine, they get fake outrage. And they want to tell you it's disrespecting this country and disrespecting the flag. And they don't remember that flag is one, and that anthem is one that people fought for, that it wasn't even protecting them. That anthem at the time and that war at the time was being fought by slaves. Right on with everybody else. Those same slaves that even after victory didn't even want to go home because they were going to still be enslaved. The third and fourth stanzas of the national anthem will show you exactly what that's all. But nobody wants to talk about that. Everybody wants to talk about this man that took a knee, and they want to disparage him. And I'm not saying he's perfect, and I'm not saying he's done everything right. But if you look at that knee as the problem and not what he was kneeling for, you are a part of the problem. And the church can't be scared to talk about it, and we can't fear talking about it. Just like we don't want to fear racism, we can't fear talking about it. Our people are disadvantaged. Our people are of color are disadvantaged. People say, "Oh, well, you have every advantage now. You can go to college. You can get your education. You can do that." Yeah, but going to college for somebody of color is a lot more costly than going to college for somebody who's not, in a lot of situations. And not everybody fits into everything. So don't get me wrong. It's not all people, just like it's not all people of color. But for the most part, when you look at it, there's a disadvantage. We're at a different starting point. So the goal is still the same for everybody of all cultures. Everybody's running on the same track. The issue is we started back here and other people started further ahead because their father was a booster to a college, or their mother was on the board of some company. So they got a head start. So now you're fighting to catch up. But meanwhile, as you move ahead, they've moved ahead. And now it's an uphill climb. And so as much as we fight, I'm a college graduate twice. I have a master's degree, and I have a lot of debt behind it to go with it because it costs a lot to get an education that they told us we have to have in order to succeed, but one that I rarely use in my day-to-day life. My job has nothing to do with what I went to school for directly. Now, obviously, indirectly, the things you learn affect you as you work, no doubt about it. But when we move forward past 1860 and 1964 into today, these things are still happening. You still have an alt-right. What is an alt-right? An alternate right, led by Richard Spencer, well, he's one of the leaders, who sat down and had the audacity to sit down and talk to, do interviews, and had the audacity to say that the U.S. needed to keep its culture, it's inherently a white culture and a white history. Still believes in white privilege. Believes that Donald Trump is the guy to lead them back to that. Now think about that. This is now. This is not 1964. This is not 1864. This is right now. This is what is happening right now. And this is what we're facing. And you ask the question, why is it unfair? Why would this stuff happen? Because of this systemic racism. The prison system alone, if you look at the number in a prison system, somebody floated, as soon as something happens, somebody will float a statistic to you and they'll say, there's more whites in prison than there is blacks. And don't take into account that whites make up 76% of the population in the country. Of course there's more. 76% to 13% blacks. But if you look at those numbers as a ratio of the numbers, do some statistical analysis instead of looking on the surface. I'd rather have the KKK. I'd rather have the guy with the swastika. I'd rather have the alt-right tell me exactly what they are and who they are than to have that friend that comes to my Facebook page and tells me about the number of whites in prison, or tells me about black on black crime, which in and of itself is a misnomer, because when you're populated with people that look like you, that's what the crimes are committed on. So nobody says white on white crime. Have you ever heard that term?
Not until you just said it.
Nobody uses it. Why is that? Doesn't make any sense. And it's unfortunate because a lot of these things are perpetuated on us as people of color, and we start to adapt this self-hate mentality, and we start to talk about ourselves in a less than flattering way. And see, I know I get it. I get it. And I know I'm getting fired up, and I know I'm getting emotional because y'all don't understand. We live it every day. Every day I have to think about it. I remember Justice when I was in school, when I was in college in Ann Arbor. My advisor, my counselor in high school, he told me, he said, this is going to be different than you've ever experienced. He said, you've been going to a culturally diverse high school in Flint Central. This is going to be different. When I went to U of M, we were 7% black. 7% black out of 30 some odd thousand students. It wasn't a lot. I had classes with hundreds of students where I was the only black person in there. And, I didn't have a problem with it because I had been around culturally diverse all my life, being at Dora Ryder, being at Flint Central. I had been in a culturally diverse situation the whole time. Even my time at Longfellow High School, being in the magnet program, or Longfellow Middle School. But I'm in Ann Arbor, Justice. The second day I was there, freshman year, we gone to orientation, we went home, came back, and moved in. My roommate and I, Tyshawn Johnson, we moved in. We took the bus from North Campus, where we stayed, down to Central Campus. And we're walking through. And I happened to stop and pick up a flyer that was on the ground. And that flyer was for a KKK rally that had just gone through campus. In the middle of my campus in 1996. This was 1906. This is 1996. And I opened my eyes real big to what's going on. And I remember another time I'm on the bus after we had left the gym. We were tired playing basketball all day. And so my friends and I, it was only about 5 people on the bus total. And so we had sat in the seat and we had put our legs up on the adjacent seat next to us. And I mean, our stop was towards the end of the route. And so we were kind of head back, nodding. And the bus driver stopped the bus, pulled the bus over and stopped the bus. Came back to us. Asked us why we had our feet on the seat. Demanded that we took our foot down off the seat. And when we questioned him why, there's nobody sitting here, that he threw us off the bus. And you got to imagine 3 18-year-old young men not having experienced this before are going through this. Why? There was no other reason. There was no other reason but we were young black men with a white bus driver that had a vendetta. Now, we didn't know anything about reporting it to the police. We didn't know anything about that. We never experienced. We're walking home now, disgusted, destroyed, devastated. I've been pulled over several times just driving down the street because my windows were tinted. In one situation, I remember pulling out of the parking lot of the bowling alley and pulled out of the car because the windows were tinted on the vehicle. I got pulled over on an expressway because the windows were tinted on my car, which weren't tinted. They had no tint other than what was there from the factory, but it was just to pull me over and check out my license. Why? See, we have to realize and understand, for you that's coming up and that maybe potentially want to get involved in the political arena, these are still the things that are happening. And so we have to see and hear these stories of this discrimination and these stories of people like 2 days ago, like George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, who, I don't care what he had done. The story goes he was being arrested under suspicion of forgery. But to see a police officer with his knee on his neck and his hands in his pocket, and to hear that man say, "I can't breathe," and cry out for his mom right before he was losing his life. And to see those 3 other police officers look around as if nothing was happening. And the people are all around begging them to stop. Please stop. Please stop. When can you step in and prevent injustice when it's happening from the police? But we see a problem with Colin Kaepernick's knee more than that knee that was on that man's neck. And see, people don't understand the effect that has on somebody like me, who has to walk out the door and look at himself in that same position and wonder what's going to happen to me. And yeah, I'm a man of faith, and we talked about that, and I believe that I carry myself in the right way. I don't have a record, but it doesn't matter all the time. It doesn't matter. You know, the crazy thing, Justice, until this happened with George Floyd, and I believe as I was doing some thinking, I started putting things together. A few years ago, I walked up on a car that had 3 guys laid out. 2 of them were laid out in the front seat. One had literally opened the back door and laid out on the ground from an overdose of opioids, heroin. And I had to sit there and I'm yelling and I'm pushing it on it, and they tell you to stimulate them, so I'm hitting their arm, trying to wake them up, yelling, "Hey, hey, hey," no, and they're not responding. And I know y'all saying, what does that have to do with racism? How do you think these drugs got here? They didn't make heroin, and they certainly didn't lace it with the stuff that it was laced with. I had to watch as the paramedics and the police came and they administered several doses of Narcan, the stuff that's in this container right here, to fight against the opioid adults. And I watched 2 of them come out of it, and I watched one. I'm not sure what happened. They put him in the back of the ambulance and took him to the hospital. I don't know if he's dead or alive to this day. And I thought it was an isolated incident. I thought it had nothing to do with racism. It has nothing to, in my mind, I'm good at compartmentalizing. Until just yesterday, I walked up on the car on my way to work at the end of my street, parked out in the street, brake lights on, and I'm trying to figure out why the brake lights on. Why is the car parked out towards the middle of the street? Oh, I got enough room to get around. And so when I'm driving by, naturally I look over and I see a young lady head back in the seat, sleep, it appears. So many voices inside of me. Some of them said, just go to work. Nothing to do with you. Some of them said, you can't do that because if something happens to her out here, you go back. So I turned around and I parked next to her and I grabbed my phone because I wanted to be ready to call 911 if I had to. And I opened my door, and as soon as I got out, I heard police sirens and I stopped. And I said, oh my God, if I walk up to this car, they're going to think I did it. And then what's going to happen to me? Why do I have to think like that? My whole focus should have been on trying to see what's going on with this young lady, not thinking about what could happen to me if the police see me. I don't know if this person is going to wake up and yell and scream out because they don't know who I am. I don't know what's going on. I'm walking into a situation where you just don't know. And so I walked up to the car and I can see, she had her window down about a third of the way, and I looked over there and you could see her looked asleep. So I'm yelling. She had nothing but her underwear on. Had marks on her legs right here on her thighs that looked like maybe she had been drugged at some point across the ground. So I'm yelling, hey, hey, hey. And finally she looks up on the third hey. So I'm relieved that she's not dead. I'm relieved that it's not like those guys I walked up on an overdose. And she looked at me and I said, hey, are you okay? Are you okay? And she proceeded to just roll up her window. And I said, wow. But I couldn't, something inside me just wouldn't let, I had to make sure she was okay. I had her license plate number. I had the car, make and model. But the crazy thing is I didn't want to call the police and risk her getting trumped up charges for a wild night either. So it's this balance in my head. Do I call? Do I not? What do I do? And so I can see her through her rolled up window reaching for her clothes. And so that's when I went back and got in my vehicle. And then I pulled around the block and I came up on the other end of the block where I could still see the vehicle, her car. And I saw her drive off and I said, well, I got to follow to make sure she's not under the influence. I don't want anybody else to be hurt either. And so I'm driving behind her and she stopped at a stop sign and she sat there for a couple minutes. So I said, oh man, maybe she fell asleep again. Maybe worse. So I got ready to pull up and then she took off. And I got caught by a light and I don't know where she went. And I hope to God that she's okay right now. But it made me tie all these things together, that this systemic and the systematic racism causes all kind of different issues. It causes mental issues. It causes me to have to think about X, Y, and Z when I should be thinking about just helping my fellow man. It causes me to think about what my nephews are going to have to go through if they get pulled over and they don't know how to handle it. It makes me think about what I'm going to do when I get pulled over the next time. Trying to keep myself safe. Looking like I'm a big guy that's got a big bushy beard, especially right now. Is that going to make me look like a threat in a police officer's eyes? And again, all police officers don't hear my heart. All police officers aren't bad. But will the good ones call out the bad ones and so we can get rid of them? Is the fraternity that strong that you can't get rid of the ones in your own company? All these fatal shootings by police, 1 in 5 officers' names never get told. They never have to deal with the scrutiny. They never have to deal with their names being slandered across. But the victim always does. The victim always have to deal with their past and what they did in their past. And, oh, he was walking through an abandoned house. Oh, he was arrested before. Oh, he done drugs before. They always have to go through this tarnish, and nobody focuses on the fact that they're now dead. And see, these are the things that are happening today. And then you have to deal with the people's racist attitude. Oh, just look at the statistics. There's more white people shot by police than black people. And again, not realizing that it's literally twice as likely to happen for a black person. And if you add in other people of color, such as Hispanics, the numbers even go up. 13% of the population, 26% of the people shot by police. It doesn't add up. And you wonder why we get emotional when we see George Floyd and those like him. That's why. Because every day we live in the same thing. And so your mental game is messed up. Your head is messed up because every day you have to think about this. There was a study that came out in 2019 in LA Times. 1 in 1,000 black men and boys can expect to die as a result of police violence over the course of their lives. That's 2.5 times higher than their white peers. 1 in 1,000. Now that risk falls and rises with age, but we're talking about basically 20 to 29 years old. And now they're finally starting to tie it back to mental health issues. There was a study published in Lancet last year, or in 2018, that found out that police killings of unarmed black men were associated with an increase in mental health problems such as depression, emotional issues for black people living in the state where the killing took place. Living in constant fear can lead to stress. Constant fear of being in that position. Constant fear of having to have that talk with your son. Have that talk with your nephew. A conversation that many black people have to have with their children about how to interact with the police and try to avoid dying. You know, Justice, I heard your father talk about it today. And I heard him talk about having to tell you and your brother about how to deal with the police without living in fear of chasing your dreams, without living in fear of going for what you need to do in life. And I know it's got to be a hard position to be in. And we could list names of people killed by police, some you heard of and some you haven't heard of, and some will be on your screen. But some of them, 13-year-old Tyree King, Deborah Danner was a 66-year-old woman that had scissors in her hand and a mental illness, and they knew she had a mental illness, and they shot and killed her anyway. Sean Reeves, 21-year-old military vet. Terrence Franklin shot in a dark basement where they said he tried to wrestle a rifle away from a police officer. Miles Hall was a guy whose family called the police to help subdue him because they knew he had a mental illness, and the police shot and killed him even though they had tasers that they could have used. William Green, Tamir Rice, Botham Jean, E.J. Bradford, Michael Brown, Michael Dean, Stephen Clark, Jamie Johnson, Antoine Rose, who was 13 and unarmed. See, we think we don't have to worry about this till we grown. This is a 13-year-old boy. How old are you, Justice?
18.
You're 18. You're driving. Everything you do can be thought of as a threat. And we have to understand it. But then we have to not live in fear of it. So I know you don't have probably the same anecdotal stories that I do in your shorter time here in life. But I'm sure you've seen some racism so far that maybe you didn't even realize was racism at the time, or maybe you did.
I of course, we all have to live through that. But I don't know what the old saying is, but when you are doing the same behavior as the other person is doing, that doesn't make you any better. Now, I'm not saying that black people were being racist towards white people, like they were doing all the things that we just mentioned. But it does exist there. And
what exists?
Racism, people call it reverse racism, where black people are being racist towards white people. But
is that a reality or a misnomer?
Well, I mean, it's a reality to some people. But I think it is around because of the lack of knowledge of each other's culture. Because in one of the laws, I love how this is symbolic. I don't love the law, I like the symbolism of it. And one of the laws in Alabama was you had to put up a wall between the African Americans and the Caucasians. They couldn't be in the same area. So we kind of grew up apart from each other. And we learned to love the company of our own. And that mentality kind of dropped on to the next generation. And so you see this all the time. I saw this in school in Swartz Creek. It was a majority Caucasian school. But you had Caucasians over here. And you had the black people over here, the black children over here. And they would never go and speak to one another. They'd always, they have their culture and it's still separate and equal. But we've done it to ourselves, I feel like.
That's interesting. I wholeheartedly disagree. Okay. There certainly can be prejudices from the black race to other races. There's no doubt about that. They can be prejudices for sure. But because you commune with people that have the same likes and the same norms and behaviors as you do, that's the nature of culture. That's literally the definition of culture. And so what you're finding in these schools, your school in particular, is a subculture. These are subcultures within our culture. And so they're basically with people that they can associate with or they can bond with on the basis of some things. Now, when I was in school, like I said, I went to a multicultural school, but I bonded with the people that were in my classes because we were segregated. Not by culture, we were segregated by being in this magnet program or gifted program. And so when I was in elementary school, we were upstairs. The rest of the kids were downstairs. When I was in middle school, we were on the third floor, or we were on this special wing, and everybody else was in the other wing. When I was in high school, we were on the third floor, and every other classes were below, and things like that. And so we bonded with those people that were in that group because we could relate to each other along those lines. So I don't think it's necessarily about doing it to ourselves. I don't know what we've done to ourselves, but we certainly didn't choose to be black. We certainly didn't choose our color. And so, yeah, are there things that we can do to make things worse on ourselves? Oh, absolutely. Being on the wrong side of the law doesn't help. But when you look at those things that have happened, and if you point to the few accounts where the wrong happened, it's just like with George Floyd. If you look at that situation and you point to the fact that he got arrested for what he did, and that shows me that's part of the problem, because no man that got arrested and is in custody deserves to die. Doesn't matter what he did. But yet, this guy had to lose his life. And it's not just, the problem is it gets people thinking that, hey, I can just call the cops and they'll be more aggressive towards them if they know he's black. Just like the lady in Central Park, Amy Cooper, who called the police on a bird watcher, Christian Cooper, who said all he did was ask her to put her dog on a leash. And she made sure she told the cops, this is an African American, so they'll come running. That's threatening her. Or Tom Austin, who called some black men using the gym because he didn't believe they should have been in the same building he was in. Kevin Frederick, some of y'all know him as Kev on Stage. He had his studio. The police kept getting called by people that were racist and prejudiced against them. And they kept calling the police. And the landlord eventually put him out without even investigating, because they didn't realize what was going on until it was too late. You had a student at Yale calling it on another student that was sleeping in a common area. You had a white woman in Oakland County, in Oakland, calling on a black family having a barbecue in the park. You had the Yale police pulling a gun on a kid walking back to his dorm. And they had no idea that young man's father happened to be a columnist in New York and wrote a very interesting column about exactly what I was talking about earlier, about having to get a call saying your son has been in a situation with the police. Or then you get the ones empowered by thinking they're helping the law. The Trayvon Martins, the Ahmaud Arbery, that are killed by citizens thinking they're lawmakers or they're law keepers or they're law enforcers. What is the point here? The point is, that we have to realize that racism still exists. Whether you are Christian or not, it still exists. As Christians, we have to have a reality of that it exists, and we know that we're fighting against a spiritual situation that the devil is certainly promoting. He's certainly pushing that it keep existing. He certainly doesn't want us to come into the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace and to live in harmony. Doesn't want it at all. But we can't keep closing a blind eye to the reality of it. And we need to talk about it. We need to tell people how God deals with it, how God talks about it, how the Bible speaks about it, particularly in the New Testament. We need to understand that. We need to be able to have this discussion. We need to be able to put on these type of programs and let people know that what you're feeling, that fear, is not uncommon. And it's okay to not be okay. I'm not okay right now. I'm not. I'm sitting here thinking about it and tearing up just thinking about it, because I'm not okay. But it's okay for me to be not okay. It's okay for Justice to have that view, but Justice needs to have that conversation just like we're having. He's not wrong for having that opinion. That's what he's experienced. But he also has to have conversations with older people, with his parents, with his grandparents, with other people that he trusts, with other people that can give him some real life situations. I mean, there's so many more. There's so many more that I could go on just on my personal life. I could talk about being called the N-word at work as recently as 2006. I can talk about having a noose tied around a bottle at work, or having a noose put up on a board on the shop floor. I can talk about that because it happened. It's all documented. Danielle Solomon says, she's a vice president for race and ethnicity policy at the Center for American Progress. She said, despite the familiar brutality of this week and the past 400 years of systematic inequality, black people will remain resilient. But this can't be our fight alone. It must be a collective fight where white Americans join us in fighting for real freedom. And that's what we want to talk about, freedom. We will continue to find joy. We will continue to speak out against injustice. We will continue to fight white supremacy. Just join us. We know that it's here, but we're not going anywhere. We won't live in fear. Your father, Justice, he said fear is for others. He said that's what's on his favorite shirt. Fear is for others. And I have something. This is my mask, y'all. My mask says fear is a liar. I won't live in fear on a consistent basis. I will live in reality, though. What are your closing thoughts, Justice? Any closing thoughts?
Well, I hope you all have a better understanding of where racism came from, the foundation, and where it is and what it is today. And I do think that racism is here to stay. It just evolves over time. Obviously, we're not going to see segregation in these places anymore, but we're going to see it in other things. So, like for example, and I'm this is my last for example. You do research and you figure out some things. I'm interested in real estate, and one of the things that I'm learning right now is that you got a lot of places where there's pockets of African Americans and there's pockets of Caucasians in these areas. And usually the Caucasians live in not so ideal conditions, horrible conditions, if I can say that. And then you have these pristine houses over here. Take Flint, for example. You drive into Flint, you look around, you see these abandoned houses, you see houses with broken windows, boarded up, and then you see a nice house, it's got a nice lawn and stuff everywhere. That's what I think about.
You ever heard of redlining?
Yeah, that's what I was talking about.
I thought so.
Yeah. But then you think about my Granny Brown. She died just a few months ago. And she lived through that. And I know my Granny Wortham did too. In fact, she, if I remember correctly, she picked cotton down in Mississippi. And what I've heard about that is that the cotton it's got thorns in it. And so you prick your finger and you start bleeding. And it's not a great thing to do. So, but they were resilient people. As far as I'm concerned, the people that came out of that era were the strongest people I knew. So it's important that we all stay with the faith, stay resilient. One thing that black people back in the day knew, that God was going to deliver them from all their troubles. They sang songs to try and get through it.
Yes, they did.
And so whatever happens, remember, we always say this: God's got us. God understands that there is one race. He created one race. We are all different, but we're all the same.
Come on.
Man, I'm preaching this,
Preaching
man.
That.
So,
that's good.
Yeah.
That's good, man. That's growth, because I know you, and that's growth in you. And I just want to say this to you and to all my young people out there. I always got your back. If you face this type of stuff, you can always come to me. We can talk it out. We can look at next steps. We can do what we have to do to get through it. But there's always going to be somebody in your corner should you need it. So we are resilient. We are as a race, as a whole. We are resilient as a people. And you couldn't have said that any better. And like you said, we have to keep the faith. God got us. Justice said it perfectly. And God thinks about us so highly. All of us are one and the same. He told us that in Galatians, Justice, chapter 3, verse 26 through 28. He said, "For you are all children of God through faith in Christ Jesus." So when we accept Christ, we're all the same children of God. And all who have been united with Christ in baptism have put on Christ, like putting on new clothes.
There is no longer Jew or Gentile, or you could say black or white, slave or free, male and female, for you all are one in Christ Jesus. And now that you belong to Christ, you are the true children of Abraham. You are his heirs, and God's promise to Abraham belongs to you.
Remember God's promises to Abraham. He would multiply. His seed would be like the sand. Those promises he promised to Abraham belong to us because we are united together with Christ. We all know that naturally there's male and female. Naturally we are different colors. But once we're in Christ, spiritually, we're all one. We're all the same. And if we could all get on that level, that's what this world needs now. This world needs to quit putting ourselves on opposite spectrums, opposite ends of the spectrum, and come together truly as one nation under God.
Indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
God bless you. Till next week. Remember, like this video, share it, subscribe, click the notification bell. And if you have any information that you want to send us, you can send us at khmsocialmedia@gmail.com. Send all the bad stuff care of Justice.
Yes, and I know that there's going to be no bad talk about these beautiful, wonderful suspenders.
Y'all be blessed.
Yes, be blessed. You know, I think I'm going to buy you some suspenders. My new paycheck money.